In her memoir, The Last Girl, our speaker, Nadia Murad, made a statement that will resonate with the Holocaust survivors who are present. She wrote, "Each time you speak it, you relive it. To relive memory can be extraordinarily painful and difficult, but doing so has purpose when it inspires people to learn, to remember, and above all, to act. And that is what all of you who have participated in this contest have done." Nadia Murad is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and presidential fellow at Chapman University. She was born in Iraq, the youngest of 11 children. She grew up in a family that had little in material wealth, but was rich in love and community and culture. That life ended abruptly 10 years ago, in 2014, when Nadia and her Yazidi community were targeted for forced conversion, enslavement, or death by the terrorist group known as ISIS. Nadia was just finishing high school and dreaming of what her future might be. Suddenly, it seemed that she had no future, or at least no future of her own choosing. This too will sound very familiar to the Holocaust survivors who are with us. While the Nazis targeted Jews in the Holocaust for their alleged race, ISIS targeted the Yazidis for their religion. Yet the two persecutions have much in common. Both Jews and Yazidis were treated as less than human, as property, not persons. Both were deported from their homes and robbed of their belongings. Like so many Jewish women in the Holocaust, Nadia's mother had to part with her most precious material possession, her wedding ring. Ultimately, 7 members of Nadia's family, including her mother, were murdered. Nadia herself was subjected to brutality so extreme that it defies description, so horrific that she considered suicide. Only the memory of her beloved mother stopped her. As Nadia writes, quote, "For her, nothing in life was bad enough to justify suicide. We wouldn't kill ourselves. We would help one another as much as we could and take the first opportunity to escape," unquote. Memory empowered Nadia to choose life and to fight her oppressors. Ultimately, she did escape, thanks in part to a Muslim family who risked their own lives to rescue and help her. But freedom for Nadia, as for many Holocaust survivors, also brought new pain and a deep sense of guilt for surviving when so many she loved did not. Freedom meant life in a refugee camp and an uncertain future far away from the land and life she had known. Freedom brought days of mourning the dead and failed efforts to free those still in captivity. Memory seemed as much a curse as a blessing. But in time, Nadia, like so many Holocaust survivors, found the strength to transform memory into action. Agonizing though it was, she began to speak of what she had experienced and what she had witnessed. She told her story and shared her memories in the hope that they could make a difference. Nadia writes in her memoir, quote, "Every time I tell my story, I feel I am taking some power away from the terrorists. We defy them by not letting their crimes go unanswered," unquote. As Nadia will share with us today, Memory can change the world, as she and her husband Abed are doing. Perhaps in time, memory can even help to heal the world, what in Hebrew is called tikkun olam. This is what Nadia and Abed are working to do through the project Nadia's Initiative. It is a tremendous honor to welcome Nadia Murad.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, for such a kind introduction. Thank you, President Struba, Vice President Parlo, faculty and staff at Chapman. Thank you so much for having me again. And to the survivors of Holocaust, thank you for sharing your stories and the stories of those who never had a chance to share their stories with the world. And good morning, everyone. 10 years ago, when I was not much older than you are now, I was living in my village of Kojo in Iraq. Like all of you, I had hopes, dreams, and plans for my future. But my childhood included a constant barrage of discrimination. Slander and conspiracy theories about my community were always on our radar. I never learned about the history of my community at school because we had been excluded from the history books, erased from the records. And what happens when a community is erased? When no one listens to or speaks up for the oppressed, for a group seen as the other. Inaction and systemic marginalization opened the gates for the campaign of terror that the so-called Islamic State carried against my community. Who would notice our disappearance when there was never any acknowledgement of our rights or existence? Growing up, I was surrounded by 10 brothers and sisters, beautiful nieces and nephews, many cousins, and a mother who I adored above all else. Like many families in the village, my family were farmers. When I was not at school, I would help in the fields or take care of livestock. As a minority community, Yazidis were not rich. We had no political power and had little access to the opportunities given to other Iraqis. But we had purpose, and we were content. Over the past 9 years, I have delivered many speeches and taken part in many interviews. I have told my story and the story of my people over and over again. I would have to ever describe the horror of August of 2014, when ISIS brought genocide to our land. My life and the lives of so many were shattered. Our dreams, homes, farms, and villages were destroyed. I have spoken about the way they murdered village after village before taking thousands of women and girls into sexual slavery. Everyone was aware that ISIS came to kill, rape, and destroy because they were genocidal and public about their objectives. What many people may not know is that ISIS was not alone. Our neighbors who lived next to us for generations, who came to our villages and attended our weddings and broke bread with us, suddenly joined ISIS and helped them commit genocide. I am not the first girl to tell a story of persecution and war. 80 years ago, in a country far away from my own, a little girl put pen to paper. Growing up in rural Iraq, I didn't know about Anne Frank. When we studied World War II in school, we read only about heads of state and military commanders. The idea that a young girl could have something important to say about anything, let alone war, would have been unthinkable in our classroom. But years later, when I was finally able to read her diary, I felt an extraordinary kinship with Anne. There were obvious differences in our stories. We practiced different religions and spoke different languages. I survived war, and she did not. But like me, Anne knew what it meant to live as a minority, to be hated and hunted. She knew what it meant to be angry and to feel the burn of injustice. Anne's writing brought her experience in that cramped annex to life. She described her fear and loneliness, but also her delight in a new pair of shoes and her first crush. Surrounded by posters of movie stars on her small bedroom wall, she contributed more to our collective memory about the impact of war than any general ever could. Through her writing, we understand how persecution affects ordinary people. She was one of 6 million who died in the Holocaust, and her diary reminds us that each of those 6 million was a person with hopes, dreams, and desires. When I wrote my book, I wanted to honor the thousands of Yazidis who died during the genocide. I wanted to tell the world that each person killed was a mother, a father, a brother, or a husband who was loved, whose lives weren't so very different from those living elsewhere in the world and were equally precious. It is a tragedy that Anne Frank never grew into womanhood. I'm sure she would have become the journalist she wanted to be and would have continued shining a light on the darkness of the world. Because there is something about surviving an experience like this that makes you want to take action, to ensure that never again is a reality, not an aspiration. When I survived captivity, I spoke to everyone I could. I told reporters, investigators, and politicians that Yazidi girls were being traded, enslaved, and raped. I told them that this was not just a byproduct of conflict, but a deliberate tactic by ISIS, who believed that by using sexual violence against women and girls in the Yazidi community, they would ensure that Yazidis will never be able to recover from this genocide. To end genocide and future atrocities, we need stronger protections for minority groups. We need to empower and raise up those who are vulnerable to violence. That is why my organization, Nadia's Initiative, is working to rebuild the Yazidi homeland. We want to determine our own destiny and rebuild our lives. But Sinjar is one very small part of the world. There are so many communities still living in fear, not knowing if there will be anything left for their children, or even if they will survive from one day to the next. They may seem far away to you, perhaps even in countries you have not heard of yet. But each of those people is precious. They deserve the same safety you and I are enjoying right now in this hall in Orange. We must work to develop our collective conscience and view ourselves as citizens of the world. We have to hold all stories in our common memories, no matter how difficult they are, because it is only by recognizing our shared humanity that we can prevent more atrocities. Despite everything that I have seen and experienced, I am an optimist. I truly believe that through the work, the kind of empathy that you and others have shown through their work, we will all begin to value each human life and see ourselves in human being in each one of them, just as we saw ourselves in Anne Frank. Putting ourselves in the place of others means following our moral compass, which points always toward justice. And as we march steadily in that direction, there will be those who tell us that the fight is too difficult and urge us to turn back. I had no choice but to keep moving forward. And neither do women and girls facing persecution around the world, and neither do you. I want to leave you with a final thought from the introduction I wrote for the 75th anniversary edition of Anne Frank's diary. Anne wrote about the hatred she felt being in a Jewish family, first in Germany and then in the Netherlands. She described how that hatred starts small and grows slowly. After Jews were banned from public transport, Anne was angry about having to walk on a hot day. Although she was young, she recognized injustice. She knew that discrimination could seem mundane before it became violent. It was the same for my community decades later in Iraq. I felt the same anger during our war, and when I read Anne's diary, I felt it for her too. Thank you so much for having me.